Welcome to the Thursday Pivot. My name is Lori Power and I'm a group benefits specialist. Benefits are my only business, so we are strategically focused. We build intentionally designed benefit packages and are consistently responsive after the sale. It's due to the consistently responsive that we started the Thursday Pivot in the first place. Business owners need to know what it takes to get strong and get through this tidal wave of change. And that brings us to today's guest, Murray Whitby, owner and founder of Policy Protec. Let's start a little bit, Murray, with a bit of a background on yourself and how Policy Protec came into being.
You bet. Thanks, Lori, and thanks for having me here today. So Policy Protec is a company that I founded 2 years ago in 2018. And I founded it because I saw a niche or a gap in the marketplace actually for customized policies for organizations. I saw a lot of examples of policies and organizations that weren't very effective and weren't certainly serving their organizations and weren't protecting them from the risks that they face due to legislation, common law, and basically social risk. And so my goal was to provide a solution to help organizations mitigate those risks, but also to achieve their strategic objectives and to engage their employees. And I started it, like I said, in 2018, and it's really taken off. There's quite a demand for it there. I serve all provinces except Quebec, and I serve all styles of incorporation, whether you're provincially incorporated, federally incorporated, not-profit, for-profit. Basically, any organization with employees is my client.
Well, with the broad breadth of clients that you have going, policies, procedures, and guidelines seem to be in a tidal wave of flux. I mean, nobody can say any different. And it depends on the direction of the wind these days on how a business owner can even keep up. As business owners, what do we really need to do? What's top of mind so that we don't drown under all of these procedural differences and changes that are going on?
Sure, and it's a good question. So the first thing is to simplify. And I think people have a kind of a distaste for or almost a fear of policy because they're used to seeing the kitchen sink policies, as I call them. So people will try and put everything they know about a certain topic into a policy, and really that's not that helpful because it's difficult to maintain, it's difficult to approve, it's difficult to follow as an employee or as a manager. And so the first thing is to simplify and to understand that a policy is a very discrete thing, and that there's other things that support policies, such as guidelines and procedures and job aids and so on. And so a policy is simply the documentation of a decision that the organization has made, and then the commitments the organization states to bring that decision to life, and the expectations it has of its employees to bring that decision to life. And that's all you need in a policy, and the rest can be put in other documents.
I'm really glad that you mentioned the difference between those, Murray, because I have to tell you, so often, you as somebody who's not in that world, I state policies, procedures, guidelines, and I lump them together as though they are all one thing. And that would be like in my world saying that life insurance is the same as disability, is the same as healthcare. And I'm really glad that you outlined the differences there, because so often people who are not in the trenches will lump them together. That leads me to the thought process that as business owners, we're very often working in silos. How do those silos, and what I'm thinking of is silos with regards to compliance officers versus privacy versus guidelines. How do those things talk to one another, and where do you work with a business owner to pull those things together?
And certainly it's depending on the size of the organization. Some organizations are big enough to have dedicated compliance officers, and some industries practically demand that if you're in financial services, you need compliance officers. But I'll sort of circle back a little bit in that there's a number of functional areas or specialties in any organization. There's human resources, there's health and safety, there's information technology, there's finance and accounting, there's general management, operations, quality. all of those functional specialties bring functional experts to bear, and typically that's what you hire. But all those areas also require, to support their strength and ongoing, what's the word for it, effective operations. They need policies to put out there to all employees and managers especially. And so, you know, you've got HR folks writing the HR policies, you've got the line folks and OH&S folks writing the health and safety policies. You've got your financial people trying to write the financial policies and stay, you know, compliant with CRA and anti-money laundering and things like that. And so, you know, it's very difficult because it does become very siloed. And so you have people have their own idea of what a policy looks like. So it's really important then to, first of all, set a standard for what your documents look like, no matter who the author is, no matter what the silo or functional area. And so that's sort of how we start to deal with that silo effect, is to say, look, we have a template for our policies, we have a template for our procedures, we have a template for our guideline manuals, and whoever the subject matter expert is should be following that template.
So once the template is followed, or once you go in and you do the master plan and people have it in place, is it a set it and done? Can they just forget about it?
No,
what,
and I'll circle back.
After?
I'll circle back to the original, you know, that every organization has its own unique requirements for policies and procedures and guidelines. And so a small organization simply needs to comply with, you know, some of the major employment standards, legislation, health and safety legislation, some of the CRA. And so you don't really need a lot of policy and procedure for a small, you know, 20 employee or less organization. But there are a few, it's written into law. You must have anti-violence policy, and you must have an anti-violence procedure that's written into the Occupational Health and Safety here in Alberta. And there's a number of things like that. And so it's important that, you know, you start where you are. You start with the needs of the organization, and the size of it, the industry it's in will dictate what sorts of policies especially you need or don't need, and your jurisdictions. And so you may be in more than one province. And every province has a bit of its own spin on a lot of these topics. And so you have to make sure your policies are correct and compliant for every jurisdiction where you're operating.
So let's hit the nail on the head here just a little bit, because you and I both know that we run across people who think it's all baloney, for lack of better words. You know, that, you know, the employment standards guide is there, that's already written, they don't need to have anything in-house. Human rights is there, they don't need an in-house. Take me through some of the liabilities when somebody doesn't have their own customized procedural guide.
Well, and it's a good question, because, you know, I was in a meeting today of HR professionals, and there were some there who go, don't want them, don't need them, can't stand, you know, policies. Their idea of policy is very much that, you know, kitchen sink compendium of information. But, you know, you do risk being out of compliance with legislation. And so there's some biggies: employment standards, occupational health and safety, human rights and privacy are the big ones that really apply to any organization with employees. And every one of those pieces of legislation, in terms of the laws and the standards and the codes that go with it, they have organizations within government that are basically the whistleblowers. And so there are people waiting at employment standards, there's people waiting at OH&S and Privacy and the Human Rights Commission, waiting for the call to come from the employees that you've got for an investigation. And so you risk having an employee not go to you as a manager or as an owner, but take the problem outside. And that's really the first thing you want to, you know, mitigate, is you want to make it okay for people to say, look, I think there's an issue or a concern that I have with its human rights. I feel like I'm being bullied. I think this workplace is unsafe. I think you're not paying me correctly. Rather than go to those whistleblower organizations, to bring it forward and allow them to bring it forward without repercussion, and so you can investigate it and fix it internally.
Take me through an example of both of those situations, if you would. Help me understand that a little bit more over a company who has the policies and procedures in place to allow the employee to come in-house, how would they know that in the first place versus somebody going to a whistleblower? Can you take me through a couple of examples?
Sure. And so again, when I write policies, one of the things that I put in a policy is a commitment of the organization to not provide repercussions or sanction any employee for bringing forward a concern. I put in a very clear procedure, and all these things have to be communicated. I mean, policies and procedures and guidelines are great unless you don't put them out there and make sure that people have access to them, and you can have attestation set up so people, sign off and having read policies. And there's ways to make sure people understand what they've got. But you write them to be used, you write them to be referred to, you write them so that people know the policy exists and the procedure exists, and they know where to look it up if they need it. And that's how they're read. They're not read like a storybook at night. People refer them when they need them. So that's one thing. And the second thing then, for an example, say someone has a concern or an issue with, let's use workplace bullying. And so now, harassment and bullying in Alberta was moved about 2 years ago now into the Occupational Health and Safety area. It used to be human rights and still exists in human rights, but it's now a known workplace hazard, pardon me. And so if someone feels like they're being harassed or bullied at work, they understand that all they have to do is to take that concern forward to either their boss or someone in the organization, and this process will kick in. That there's a defined process with deadlines and timelines, and there's assurances that the person who is perhaps bullying or harassing them, won't be notified unless certain conditions are met. And so there's a safety net there for people to bring forward concerns, and that's how you prevent them from going outside.
How does this protect say that the employee does go outside, or there is a complaint made outside? Take me through, you and I have talked about this in the past, how a corporation that has proper procedures and guidelines in place, what's the protection for the corporation in the event then that it does go outside?
Yeah, and you know what? They will go outside, and certainly, you do your best to encourage people to bring it forward internally, but they still have the right under law, and it's their right as citizens to take these things to those organizations, and so you acknowledge that. And so when someone does take it outside, what'll happen is, depending on the agency that's being it's raised to, Occupational Health and Safety, typically they're going to be coming out to your site if it's seems egregious enough the next day. The Occupational Health and Safety is very quick to get out onto the site, and they have the right to walk into any workplace. They don't need a search warrant or anything. They can come into any workplace and do an investigation, talk to anyone, look at any record or document, and they do. They come in and there may be a complaint about, I remember one where it was a faulty breathing apparatus in a sandblasting booth. And when they got there, they looked at that for sure, but they looked at everything else around in the manufacturing plant. And so, they typically will do an investigation and provide charges if warranted within about a month. And you have about a month to correct them, and off you go. Human rights complaints drag on for years. And so, you are basically being punished through administration as a company owner if human rights looks into a complaint brought forward by an employee. So those are kind of the end of the spectrum. The employment standards is really just about people not being paid correctly or not being paid properly on termination, things like that. They get resolved fairly quickly. But that's sort of how it can go. And so what happens is, the investigators who's coming on site, the first thing they ask for is, may I see your policies and procedures and manuals regarding this topic? And if you haven't got any, well, put out your hands and wait for the cuffs, because they're coming. You definitely have to have valid, current, effective policies and procedures in place when they show up.
It sounds so. The liabilities for corporations in that regard always wins me, to say the least. Like, it's just like a punch in the gut with all that you have to take care of, and taking care of your employees and your business, and to worry about something, like you said, that might be administratively heavy over the long term and not get to a resolution for such a long time. I understand from companies when they outsource, you brought something up really interesting. I understand from companies when they outsource those HR duties, and there is an expectation on the HR practitioner and the human resources practitioner that they are going to take care of those policies and procedures. And that isn't necessarily always the way. It may be in some cases or with some policies and compliance issues, but certainly not with all HR outsourced topics. And I believe leaves the business owner rather gaping for liability issues. What should somebody who's in that situation look for right now to say, is my outsourced company taking care of those? Or do I need to call Murray Whitby? Do I need to connect with Policy Protect to see what's happening?
Sure. And it's a good question. So it's really is a bit unfair to ask HR professionals to be the sole creator and manager of all policy in the organization. And and that's why a lot of my clients come to me, because they want to make sure their HR professionals are being successful and set them up for success. And so it's a good judicious use of an outsource to help your professionals in HR sort of get the policies rounded out. Actually, I want to circle back to the risk. I mean, every one of those laws has penalties. And so occupational health and safety, it's upwards of $500,000 per instance. There was a case recently in Quebec where a small business was sending out spam inadvertently. So they were sending out emails and their unsubscribe wasn't working all the time. And they were fined $1.1 million, a small business. And they subsequently reduced it to $200,000. But I think that company went out of business. I think that's what eventually happened to them. So the financial risk is huge, and even so, there's a lot of social risk now. The shaming and shouting people down, and sort of the piling on in the social media is a huge risk. And so if you have an employee who's wearing the company shirt or driving the company vehicle, and they do something untoward online, that reflects on your organization, and it can cause a lot of damage to your brand. And so I think the risks are not just legal, but also social. So back to your question, really, if an organization or business owners feel like there is opportunity to make their policies more complete, more comprehensive, and more correct or valid, then they can seek out organizations like me to do an assessment. I typically, and my competitors will assess your existing policies and procedures and give you a gap analysis, and then make recommendations.
And I think that's the best approach, isn't it? We want to know where the gaps are and be able to fill those holes in with cement, really. I don't want anything less than cement or steel or something to keep those regulators and compliance government people out of the door. To my world, you're presently working on a benefits folio for procedures, and that's right up my alley. I find it's a huge miss, which is one of the main reasons why you and I connected in the first place. Are the benefits mandatory? Have you properly terminated an employee? Have you given them the opportunity for converting some of their insurance? Can you take me through some of what would be the liability risks, or without having proper procedures that stand outside of both any insurance that you're offering the employees and accounting? It brings to mind, expenses, taxable or otherwise, and take me through a little bit about what that's going to look like for employers.
Well, on the benefits side, what I'm finding is most organizations don't have a benefits policy or a compensation policy. Just assume that, we do comp and benefits, and it chugs along. But again, a policy is simply a decision articulated. And so what is your decision around benefits? And it can be as simple as, we provide our employees benefits. And then, what do we commit to do as an employer regarding benefits? Well, we want a competitive package. We articulate the rights we reserve as employers. And so as an employer regarding benefits, you typically would reserve the right to make changes at your sole discretion, that you don't have to engage your employees, even though it's their benefits program. You still are the administrator and the sole decision maker, or you may commit to engage employees. It depends on your company. You may commit to provide notice of changes, or whatever you want, whatever you decide to commit to regarding benefits, you want that in your policy. And also the expectations that you ask of employees in your policy around benefits, that they are expected or required to participate if it's a mandatory aspect of the policy, that you have the right to withdraw premiums if you're charging part of the cost to your employees from their payroll, things like that. But also to having policies and clear procedures and guidelines and reference materials regarding benefits. It just eliminates confusion when things happen, when you've got to, when employees are terminated, when employees are on short-term disability or long-term disability, what happens to their other benefits? What happens when you're laying people off temporarily, as we are now these days in COVID? What happens to their benefits and the premiums? And so, rather than trying to fight every fire as it comes up, you've got this stuff pre-thunk out, and people can all refer to it: management, HR professionals, supervisors, and employees.
When you bring up some really good points, and again, this is circling my drain, if you would.
Yeah.
And we work with employment lawyers, and sometimes when there are changes to a benefit program, it can be deemed to be a material dismissal because it's compensation. Tell me how you work with lawyers in order to make sure that what you're putting in place is going to also assist if there's a need for a lawyer to come in and help.
Sure. So it's a good question, because whenever you make a material change to someone's employment situation, it can be considered constructive dismissal, and basically an employee has a right to sue for constructive dismissal if they feel that's what's happened. And so, there's a whole pile of case law that starts to guide judges around what is and what isn't constructive dismissal. And so, if you are to arbitrarily change benefits, it's important that as an organization, you've also worked with your lawyer who's drafted your employment contracts or your employment agreements or your offer letters. It's all the same thing. Whatever the employee signs off on saying these are the terms of my employment with you, that there are clauses in those agreements that the employer has retained the right to make these changes to the benefit program, and the employee agrees to that. The funny thing is, though, that may or may not hold water in court. There's a recent case in Ontario where this simply, even though the contract was airtight, the judge deemed that the power differential between employees and employers was such that there was actually constructive dismissal. So you actually probably have to be somewhat psychic to write employment contracts these days. So the short answer is, have a lawyer write your employment contracts, because they keep up with that stuff.
And that's true. I mean, sometimes it's fact over or feeling over facts, right? And the wind changes all the time. Take me through, as we come close to the end of our Thursday pivot, can you take me through an example of a company, what they look like prior to working with you, during working with you, and the after process? If you can
Sure.
take me through that example, that would help a lot.
I'll give you a good example. It was a manufacturing and drilling company that's a client of mine. And basically the situation they were facing was that they were going for a renewal of their core, their certificate of recognition for safety. And that's a big thing, because it reduces your WCB premiums. And the documents are really out of shape. And so I went in, and as I said earlier, I took all their documents on board. And so for any potential client, I sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, so people can give me their documents without fear of me using them or them being disclosed. And I reviewed all their documents, and then I came back to them with a sort of good, better, best proposal in terms of what they needed to do to get their documents to be comprehensive and current and compliant and correct. They basically went forward with my recommendations, and so then I put in place a project plan, and I manage that project. And so we start biting it off in pieces. And there's always a feedback loop where I create a first draft. My client then reviews that draft, marks it up, and we create the draft that will be then launched. There's also maintenance programs that are really important because, as you said earlier, it's always changing. The laws are changing, decisions in common law are changing, and so it's important that once policies are deployed and trained out to employees, that this is what I do, is I make recommendations to update policy, and my clients will say yes or no, or we'll make changes, and again, then redeploy the maintained or updated policies.
Sometimes I wonder if it all comes down to the risk you're willing to take as an employer when you don't take the time to consult with experts in the field like yourself. Take me through a do-it-yourself project gone bad.
Sure. And I'll just go back. My client got their core swimmingly, hands down, and hit it out of the park. So I was pretty happy with that.
Well, that is a good thing.
Yeah. Well, employer's gone wrong. I mean, you can go on to some of these, legal research sites like Lexology or other ones, and you can read all kinds of case law where it's gone bad. I think the biggest thing is when you are actually fined is a bad thing, but also too, I mean, there was a situation not that long ago in Canada where a business owner was involved in trenching. That was their business, and he was a pretty bad actor. He wasn't very safe. He didn't do a very good job, and they were on a job when somebody got killed, right? And he was actually badly injured in the trench collapse, and he was then charged under the criminal code. And so his negligence went away from OH&S, and he was charged under the criminal code, and he went to prison. So somebody died, and the owner went to prison, and his business went out of business. There's somebody who was a DIY when it came to policies. And so, you certainly can, hand off policy and procedure development to someone and put it on the side of their desk and hope that they're doing a good job. Or you can use experts, and that's that's all they do, and that is their expertise, is to develop these for you.
I think it was you on that note who told me about a Vancouver case where a electrician came in, was at a bakery, I believe, came in, was working in the back room, and the people who owned the bakery were in the next room, but they weren't in the same room with this contractor. He fell, broke a leg, and ended up suing that bakery and effectively, I think, putting them out of business because nobody was in the room to supervise them, and there was nothing in place to protect that corporate entity for when outsiders came into the premise.
Yeah, that's a good example because, under OH&S, you're responsible for every worker on site, whether or not they're your employees, and you're actually responsible for visitors and the members of the public. And so, as an employer, whether or not you've got a policy and whether or not you know it, you're responsible. And if things go haywire, you will be drugged through the ringer and investigated.
And I guess the absence of a policy is a policy unto itself. It's just a reflection of your continuous actions.
Yeah, the lack of it, again, the people, once they start investigating, if you've got nothing, it just shows a lack of due diligence. And I think that's another concept to understand, is that, you do this because it is the right thing to do, and it's appropriate to protect your organization, to protect your officers and directors, because the penalties can pierce the boundary of the corporation, and officers and directors can be fined and put in prison personally. So your due diligence is really important here.
I agree. Well, Murray, you and I both know we could talk on a multitude of subjects all day long, but because we have a commitment to keep this to 30 minutes and put it out to make sure that people understand what's being offered and the importance of having policies, procedures, and guidelines in that order and what matters most. We'll leave it there until the next time. So I thank you so much. I would invite people to watch for the Thursday Pivot, where we engage in meaningful conversation that is shifting business into success. And so until the next time, this is my virtual handshake.